So here we have first تدريب التدريب الأول. It says أعلنت نتيجة الامتحان. So now this is where I'm going to spend a little bit time on explaining مبني للمجهول, the passive form. Because as you can see, this chart here, all of them are passive. And here, all of them are active, the normal verbs. Okay, so in Arabic, we call mabni, mabni lil majhul. Mabni lil majhul. Basically, it means passive verb. So let me give you an example before I explain. If I say, fataha Muhammadun al-baba. It's very clear, right? We have fataha Muhammadun al-baba. So we know that fataha is the verb, fi'l, and Muhammad is the fa'il, which is the door. Yes, al-bab is what? Maf'ul bihi. Maf'ul bihi, which is the object. And we also know that fa'il is always marfu'. The door is always marfu', damma, which is the subject, and the object is maf'ul bihi, which is always mansub, meaning takes a fatha. This is something that we should be very comfortable right now. Fataha here, it is what? It is your standard active verb. Fataha Muhammadun al-bab. Let me write it in English what it means, so it will be easier. Muhammad opened the door. But what if I don't want to mention who opened the door? I just want to say that, the door was opened. You see, that's where the passive form comes. So we want to say the door was opened. So we're pretty much removing the door. It can be for many reasons. It could be that I don't know who opened the door, so I just want to say the door was opened. Or I don't want to mention who opened the door. But in English, remember, in English, I think it's possible to say by Muhammad. In English, you can use a passive voice, but still bring the subject, the door, which is very weird, but it's possible. You can say the door was opened by Muhammad. But in Arabic, you cannot. Once you use the passive, you cannot bring the door. Okay, make sure you understand. So now how do we do this? A few things happens. Number one, we will have some changes. We'll have some changes to the verb itself. That change will indicate that this is a passive verb. And then, of course, we have to remove Muhammad, and then we have to do something we'll talk about now. So first of all, let's talk about how do we make the verb into passive. It depends. Is it a present tense verb or the past tense verb? Let's talk about present tense verb. Let's talk about past tense verb, because usually passive forms are past tense. Most of the time, we use passive using the past tense. But the present tense is also possible. For example, let me give you an English example. This one is the past tense. The door was opened. In the present tense would be something is being done. That would be the passive in the present tense. So as you can see, this is not that common. And I don't think in this book they introduce the present tense, but I might mention it. It's not that difficult, but focus on the past tense first. So in the past tense, for the three letters, I'll explain the three letters, and then if the time permits, I can go further. In the three letters, remember, the last one is always going to be fatha in the past tense. So fataha, the last haraka always remains. So the last one will never be changed, because these are the last haraka is part of a verb. Okay, you understand? Both present tense and the past tense. The last haraka is part of the i'rab, is part of the verb itself, you can think of. So we're not touching it. So we have the fatha and we have the ha. So the main thing, the first clue that should be in your mind that this is a passive voice, if your first letter is a dhamma. If the first letter is a dhamma, that would be your main clue that this might be. It's not always, but it might be your passive. So this is first thing we do. Instead of fataha with the fatha, you put a dhamma. So we have fu. So only thing left is what do we do with the ta here. So the rule of the passive form of the past tense is you make kasra for the letter that is before the last one. So the letter before the last is what? Ta. So you make the ta into kasra. So it becomes futiha. Usually in the books of any Arabic grammar books you study, they will say simply that you make the first one dhamma and the one before the last one into kasra. Okay, this is the rule. First one dhamma, the one before the last is kasra. That is your standard three-letter verbs of passive form. So you have fataha, it becomes futiha. Kataba, kutiba. Qara'a, quri'a. Any verb you find three letters, you just do that, you have a passive form. Make sense? Then in mostly the Arabic book that I studied, they will go into how do you do for the 4 letters, how do you do into the 5 letters. But there's an easier way of explaining. It doesn't matter how many letters you have. What you do, the last one is always fatha because we already talked about, and the one before that is always kasra, and any haraka that you have, any haraka. Remember, sukun is not haraka. Any haraka that you have, you just make it dhamma, dhamma, dhamma. So give you an example. Some 3 letters we talked about, kataba. Kataba, it would be what? Kutiba. Kutiba. So this one wouldn't change. Last one becomes kasra, and anything before that, we make it into what? Dhamma. So let's say we have a'lana, the verb that we have now. A'lana. So the rule I said is that this one all of course stays as it is. So the letter before the last one we put a kasra. Yes, so we put a kasra, and anything before that we put a dhamma. So ain, do we put dhamma on here? Yes or no? No. Why? Good. Because I said it has to be a haraka. If it's not haraka, you don't put a dhamma. Sukun is not a haraka. Yes, so it stays the way it is. But this one is haraka. Yes, then you put a dhamma. So you say u'lina. And exactly this is what we have here. U'lina. So this is clear. So we only change when we have a haraka. Basically, we don't touch sukun. If there's sukun, we don't make any adjustment to the sukun because sukun is not a haraka. Now, so this is the first step. First step is to change the verb into a mabni lil majhul. Change the verb itself into a passive form. But are we done? Not quite. So if we want to say the door was open, the first thing we did is change the verb into passive. So we have futiha. Futiha. That's good. So the second thing is that we drop Muhammad. So we don't have Muhammad. So what we're left with, al-bab. Al-bab. Remember, here al-bab was with a fatha. Yes? Because this was an object. What happened is, first question, when we say the door was open in English, first one is very clear. Muhammad opened the door. So door is object. It's very clear. Muhammad opened the door. So the door is still object. But if we say the door was opened, does it mean the door becomes subject? Not really. The door is still the object. We just don't know who opened it. So technically, the door, the bab is still the object. But what happens, this is the tricky part you have to know. In Arabic, we cannot have any sentence without marfu. Usually a sentence, a speech must have marfu because this is the driver. So main element of the Arabic grammar is the marfu state. So if you have something like futihal bab, and then we said there's no file because we don't know who's the doer. So we don't have any marfu. We don't have any dhamma. So this is a problem for the Arabic language. So what they do instead, they make this one, the object, they make the object into marfu. So they will replace the maful bihi with dhamma, and they will not call it a file because this is not a file. Of course, it's not file. It's not the door opened itself. We're not saying that. So they will call naibul file. Naib is like, a replacement. deputy or something like that. So it's basically saying that somebody who's taking in charge of the file. So he's in charge of the file. So he's taking the responsibility of the file. It's not a file, but it is naibul file. So these are the few terms happen. But even if you don't know the term, just make sure you know that first thing we have to do is what we make the verb into passive form, which I explained to you. And then we have to remove the file, which is obviously, and then we make the object into marfu. From the mansub, we make it into marfu. We don't call it doer, and we also don't call it object. We call it naibul file. A little bit tricky stuff, right? And that's why they put it at the last chapter to begin with, but it should not be very difficult for you guys to grasp. Before I move, I just wanted to show you quickly, because the book did not mention about the present tense verbs. How do we make it? I'll just quickly mention it, which is not that difficult. For three letter, it's not difficult. So what is the present tense of fataha? Yaftahu, right? So you have yaftahu. Yaftahu. We have yaftahu. So how do we make that into a passive? Remember the rules, some of the rules that I mentioned? We never touch the last one. Another rule, we always make the first one into Dhamma. These rules are fixed. Okay, if you know this much already, you already know what to do. So we have what? We make the Ya into Dhamma and Ha remains as it is. And remember another one, if you have a sukun, we leave sukun alone. Okay, don't touch the sukun, leave him alone. So we leave the sukun alone. So only thing left is what do we do with the letter before the last? The letter before the last gets a fatha. Remember, in the past tense, we had a kasra. In the present tense, we put a fatha. So it would be fatha, which was the original case anyway, but that's the state. So again, one more time, the letter before last gets fatha. And the first one is dhamma. And if you want one rule that applies to all the verbs, doesn't matter whether 3 letter or 4 letters, then the rule is anything before the last one, they all get fatha. All get fatha, except for the first one, letter that has haraka. Okay, so any letter that has a haraka before the last one, all the way up into the first one, they'll all get fatha, 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 fatha. You know, it's difficult to explain. You have to write it down. I should have written it down. Maybe I'll write it down. Okay, I'll write it down for you. It's not that difficult, but you should know this. Past tense. Past tense, what do you do? Letter before the last is equal to what? Kasra. Kasra. All other haraka. This is important. Is equal to what? Who knows? Dhamma. That's it. That's your rule. Simple. Letter before the last is kasra, and all other haraka, they all get dhamma. Okay? And the present tense is what? Present tense is first letter is dhamma, all other letters until the last is equal to fatha. So here, both of them, last letter, we don't touch. We don't, last letter remains, remains as it is. Okay, makes sense? So the last letter we don't touch. So we're only interested in other letters. Make sense? So as you can see, both of them, it will end up having the first letter into a dhamma. So now you might be a little bit confused with something like this. For example, you have a'lana, a'lana. So what is the present tense of a'lana? It is yu'linu. You might be, whoa, we already have a dhamma, so wouldn't I get confused with the passive voice? Yes, if you're not careful, you can get confused with the passive voice, but what would be the passive voice? The difference would be what? Lam will have a fatha. You see the difference? Here's the lam has a kasra, but the passive lam will have a fatha. It means it's being announced. Make sense? This is the first time you're doing this one day. It's not enough. You have to practice. You have to really get into it, and then later you will see it's not that difficult at all. So I'll just quickly go over this thing, and then we'll wrap up. So we have the first one, التدريب الأول. The first one we have أعلنت نتيجة الامتحان. So as you can see, the natija here, it should have been, oh, Allah al-Mustan. There's one more thing you have to know. One more thing you have to know. This is tricky, guys. It's not simple. So this is very important. This rule is very important, which is, for example, Fataha. Fataha Muhammad al-Haqiba. Haqiba. So Haqiba gets a Fatha, right? So Muhammad opened the bag. So if we follow our rule and then we convert this one into passive voice, and it would be Futiha. So this is fine. We say Futiha, and we remove Muhammad and we say Al-Haqiba. And we said that what has to happen, the Haqiba, instead of Fatha, it's going to get a Dhamma. So Futihal Haqibatu. So is it fine? That's what I explained to you, right? So from the rules that I mentioned, this looks like we're done. Everything looks good. We have passive form, we don't have the doer, and we had the subject, and we made it into naibul file, which is gets a dhamma, so everything's fine. Yes? No, there's one more problem left. So look what happens. Once I do a dhamma here, this dhamma is related to this verb. And look at this word. This word is feminine. And the verb is what? The verb is masculine. So we're going to have a problem with this. In the beginning, it was fine because we had the file was Muhammad, and the Fataha, it is also masculine, so that we didn't have any problem. But once we changed, we made it into passive form, and we gave the Haqiba the role of the file. He's not a file, but we gave him the role of file, meaning we gave him a Dhamma. Now we have a problem because now we have, looks like our file is feminine, but our verb is masculine. We're going to have a problem. So what do? We just make Fataha into feminine. So we say Futihat. Okay, you understand? So we have to change this one into, we have one more step left, which is what? Futihat. We have to make this one into a feminine. So that's what happening. So that's why we have a feminine ta here, because natija is feminine. We cannot say ulina natija to, no, because natija is naibul fa'il, and it is mu'annath. So your fi'l needs to be mu'annath as well. Makes sense, guys? Here we don't have a problem because the bab is masculine. So we have futiha babu qubuli talibat. So the door of acceptance of the female students was opened, the passive form. Ughliqa babu qubuli talibat. So this one is opened and this is closed. Makes sense? And this one is also the full letter actually. So the verb is aghlaqa. Aghlaqa. As you can see, so this is four-letter verb. So in the four-letter verb, what we do, same thing. This one stays the same. The last one, you put a kasra, and anything before that, we put a dhamma, other than sukun. So we have this form. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all of them. Please look into every single one of them and pay attention what's going on. And why do we have a ta here, turikat? Because we have al-awraq. The three-letter verbs, when you read it, you should feel like, I know this is a passive, because we shouldn't have dhamma in the three-letter verb in the beginning. No way we're gonna have a dhamma in the beginning. It will always be fatha. Anytime you have a dhamma, in three-letter, you should be like, hold on, it should be a passive form. So we have turikat al-awraq. So you know this is a passive form. And then awraq is that the paper was left. And the reason we have a feminine ta here is because this is plural of objects. So this is something that you have to pay attention. So here quri'at natija. We have ta because of feminine. Here we don't have a problem. Sumi'a. Ad-darsu, the lesson was heard. Okay, because ad-dars is masculine, so we don't have a problem. If it was like qira'a, instead of dars, it was al-qira'a, the reading was heard, then it would be sumi'at al-qira'atu. Now, Jayid, so please go through them, and this is not easy, especially if it is the first time you're being experienced with this type of verb. Go through them, and I'll just quickly go over this one. This shouldn't be a problem. This is your standard verb. We have arafa annahu najaha bi taqdirin murtafa. So here, actually, they're showing the word anna. Remember what I mentioned to you, that inna comes in the beginning. Anna is usually in the middle. So here you cannot say innahu, because it's not in the beginning of the sentence. It's in the middle of the sentence. So arafa, he learned that he passed in the high grade. وعلمت أنهما قد نجحا في الامتحان. I learned that both of them have passed in the exams. And also pay attention, look what's happening. Here the annahu, hu, huma. So because they're pronoun, so you don't see the fatha, because remember what I said, that after anna, the isim, the noun becomes mansub, fatha. So when you have a separate like this, araftu anna Allah. Now this is not domi, this is not a pronoun. So now since it's a separate, you have to make sure that you know it will get a fatha. Anna Allah la yudihu ajra man, keep on making this mistake, man ahsana amala. So I learned that Allah does not waste rewards somebody who does good deeds. Same thing here. Araftu anna al-amida qad haddada maw'id al-imtihan. I learned that the amid, the dean, have haddada, we had this verb to specify. Maw'id is the appointed time of the exam. Haddada is to specify. Haddada means to specify. Specify. To set something, to set. But as you can see, the passive form is a little bit tricky. So please pay attention. I'm just quickly going to go through the rules one more time. The first thing is you have to make the verb into passive form. And I give you a very simple rule. The past tense, the letter before the last is kasra, and everything else gets a dhamma. And the present tense, the first letter gets a dhamma, and every other letter before the last gets a fatha. So you just have to know how to make the verb into passive. And then, of course, because it's a passive voice, you don't want to mention the door, so you remove the door. But once you do that, you're left with what? You're left with the object which has a fatha. And I mentioned to you in Arabic, this is a problem. So what they do is they make the object into a dhamma, a marfu'. And they don't call it object, and they don't also call it subject. So they give a new name, naibul file, which is the replacement of the file. And then, but once you do that, because it's taking responsibility of the file, then we know from the verb that the gender has to match. If the file is masculine, the verb has to be masculine. If the subject is the masculine, the doer is the masculine, the verb has to be masculine. If the doer is the feminine, your verb has to be feminine. So since the naibul file is taking that responsibility, so if the naib is feminine, your verb has to be feminine as well, which we saw this example here. Okay, and as you can see, these two side by side here, this is the passive form, but the naibul file is masculine, so your verb is masculine. Here naibul file is feminine, your verb needs to be feminine. Okay, so inshallah, please review them. You will be fine, inshallah.